So hello everyone and welcome back to the judicial process. This class we're discussing the jurisdiction of American courts. So if you recall, last class we discussed the law of American courts and we kind of developed the law from philosophical foundations of the law to families of the law to an exploration of common law, statutory law, as well as the elements that make up crimes. You know, for instance, actus reus, mens rea, intent circumstances, concurrence, causation, both legal and factual, and harm, assuming it's a harm-based offense. So we kind of looked at what the law is that gets applied, right? Because again, without the law, we don't have courts, we don't have a judicial system. And when we discuss kind of the philosophical underpinnings of the law, we discussed that both parties, when we're talking about like the state of nature, both sides, one that says like state of nature is violent, the other side says state of nature isn't violent, it's peaceful. They both agree that we need a court system, right? That we need some kind of adjudication system for responsibilities. But before we get a court system, we have to have laws. And what you're going to see today is just because we have laws in place doesn't mean that the courts get to hear the case or get to deal with the case, right? So what we're looking at today is jurisdiction and trying to decide which court can hear a case when something arises. So if somebody gets arrested, we do have to ask the question, where do we take this person in terms of what court do they go to? So let's look a little bit more in detail as to what jurisdiction is and what it means. So let me do this. Okay, so this gives us just kind of a blanket introduction to jurisdiction. So jurisdiction is essentially a court's power to decide a case. That's it, right? That is all jurisdiction means. It's the court's power to decide a case. So does it have the ability, does it have, and we're going to talk about how we get to that, answer that question of whether a court is a proper place for a case to be heard, and whether that court can exercise jurisdiction or can exercise its power over that defendant, over that case. That's all jurisdiction, right? And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the components of jurisdiction, what we generally have to meet in terms of requirements for jurisdiction, as well as venue. That being said, I kind of want to begin with the notion of the United States has a dual court system, right? So what does that mean? That means there's theoretically two court systems, right? So you have the states, we kind of lump them all into one system. And then on the other hand, you have the federal government, right? So there are state laws, as we discussed last class, and there are federal laws, as we discussed last class, right? So there are state courts and there are federal courts. Now, they do operate in kind of a realm of dual sovereignty, right? So let's consider this hypothetical, right? So let's consider this hypothetical. All right, so here's a hypothetical for you to consider when we're talking about jurisdiction, right? Because since we have two court systems, a dual court system, and in reality, we have at least 51 court systems, right? Each state has their own system and it's unique to that state. The federal government has its own system. And then of course that does include the territories, like Puerto Rico and places like that, which also have their own system. So to say there's a dual court system kind of means just like there's this separation of in government, there's this the idea of federalism. So we have the states have their own systems and the federal government doesn't interfere with them. And the federal government has its own system and the states don't interfere with it. But there are problems when sometimes we have overlapping, also called concurrent jurisdiction. So here's the scenario. 911 receives a call from a distraught woman in upstate New York. The woman explains that while she was driving to a local grocery store, she stopped at a red light. While waiting on the light to turn green, a man approached her vehicle and knocked on her window. When the woman cracked her window to speak to the man, he produced a gun and ordered her out of the vehicle. When the woman complied and exited the vehicle, the man struck the woman repeatedly in the face. The man then jumped into the vehicle and sped off. So this is commonly referred to as carjacking, right? So carjacking, she's upstate New York, and turns out in New York under the penal law, section 160.10, quote, a person is guilty of robbery in the second degree when he forcibly steals property and when the property consists of a motor vehicle, right? So let's say the police end up catching this guy. Right? They make an arrest. It's just the county sheriff's office. They make the arrest. They pull him over, get him out of the vehicle, make the arrest, and they're going to charge him, right? Probably with, based upon the language of the statute, robbery in the second degree. Now, here's where things get interesting. There's not a whole lot of crimes under the federal code. I mean, there are a significant number, but most criminal cases happen, in most cases in general, happen in the states, right? The federal government exercises power over very few areas of the law. Usually it has to involve something that happens between states, interstate commerce, something along those lines for the feds to get involved. And that being said, carjacking is also illegal under federal law, right? So specifically, Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2119, states, quote, whomever with intent to cause death or serious bodily harm takes a motor vehicle from a person or presence of another by force and violence or by intimidation or attempts to do so shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 15 years or both. So the state arrests, let's say the state arrests this lovely gentleman, and they take him and they charge him under New York state law. And under New York state law, he can get a certain penalty, right? So let's say we give him the maximum penalty under state law and he goes to prison for 5 years. While he's in prison, or when he gets out of prison, or at the same time that his case is going before the state courts in New York, the federal government can charge him with a crime of carjacking, and he can be tried in state court and be tried in federal court and sentenced in both. So he could finish up his sentence in New York State for carjacking, and then he would be transferred to a federal prison to serve out his sentence for carjacking under federal law. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there's always this kind of confusion, right? That that you can't be tried for the same crime twice, right? And that is true, right? Double jeopardy is true. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice. But there's a caveat. And what the caveat is by the same sovereign, right? So every state government is considered a sovereign, and the federal government is considered a sovereign, right? So you can't be tried by the same crime twice by the same sovereign. So if you carjack somebody and then you get out of prison in New York State and they arrest you as soon as you walk out of the jail and they charge you with that same crime, they can't do that. They can't arrest you. They can't charge you. They can't. You've paid your debt to society. You're done. But if you do commit a crime that is both illegal under state law and federal law, you can be tried and sentenced in both, right? Because they're dual sovereigns, right? Because we have the dual court system. New York is a sovereign, federal government's a sovereign, and we have interpreted the Constitution to mean that if you are tried by both sides, it's not double jeopardy, right? Because each one is a sovereign. So it's kind of a little technicality loophole, but it's one that does make things confusing, right? Because you have to understand, kind of like we referred to in last class, what law is being broken? What law are we asserting this person committed or violated, I should say, because it will largely determine, ultimately, what happens to not only the defendant, but what court system it goes through and how the procedures that it goes through and all that. So it's always kind of important to keep in mind when you see something like this, ask yourself, okay, it's a state law crime, but could it be a federal law crime as well? So we have dual sovereignty. Now, that being said, conceptually, jurisdiction, again, a court's power to decide a case. So in this case, the government gave New York State courts the power to adjudicate carjacking, and the Congress gave federal courts the power to adjudicate carjacking. Now, conceptually, when you think about it, like, on one hand, it kind of seems like an easy concept. You're like, well, just whatever state or county they're in, bring them to that court. It seems like an easy concept. And it also conceptually doesn't seem easy, because jurisdiction encompasses several things, several kind of subcomponents. So jurisdiction encompasses geographical and territorial jurisdiction, which is kind of what your gut reaction is, right? Like, well, he committed the crime in New York, so he's going to go to New York courts. And he's in the United States, so he's going to the federal courts. But the Constitution is very specific as to where a trial has to occur. Courts also must possess subject matter jurisdiction. And subject matter jurisdiction, which, if you've ever seen the movie Legally Blonde, is what gets her kicked out of class for not knowing. But basically, subject matter jurisdiction, and we'll talk about this in more detail, does this matter? Does whatever the case, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, felony, misdemeanor, does it fall within that court's authorized ability to hear that case? And we'll get into that a little bit more. Then the court also has to have personal jurisdiction. So they may possess jurisdiction over the case, but they might not possess jurisdiction over a person, right? So they have to, in order for jurisdiction to be proper, you have to show all of these things. And you have to show that, the prosecutor has to show that the court can exercise its power over this person. Not only the crime, not only anything like that, but also this human being. What's interesting, and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit when we relate to divorce cases, is divorce cases are really interesting when it comes to personal jurisdiction. Because you can get married in any state, whatever, you can get divorced. And generally, well, there was two rules. It used to be the state that you got married in, or the state that both couples or both the parties resided in, right? And it's changed somewhat, so you can almost get a divorce in most states, but you have to prove jurisdiction, right? Like, do they have the ability to hear this case? So let's say that you're in a marriage, the marriage goes south, you separate, you move out of state from your significant other or former significant other. Your former significant other files for a divorce, right? And let's say they are in Texas and you are in Georgia. Does that court in Texas, where they filed the lawsuits, that's where you live together, does that court in Texas have the ability, it's called a long arm statute, to pull you back to Texas to go into Texas court and try your divorce case, right? If you can test it or something like that. So personal jurisdiction actually becomes really, really important as soon as somebody crosses state lines. And it's interesting, is you would think that's where the feds would pick up, but the federal government has completely, and if you read the federal code, walked away and said it will not touch domestic relations cases, right? So it does not matter how much is involved. It does not matter who is involved. It does not matter where it was. Federal government does not do custody, does not do divorce, anything like that. It leaves those up to the states. So personal jurisdiction does become a big issue, even in criminal law, right? Of can we reach into another sovereign's borders and pull somebody back in to our court? Then we also have hierarchical jurisdiction. So we'll see that the courts are actually generally a hierarchy, and you have to go through the hierarchy. You can't automatically just be tried by the United States Supreme Court, with the exceptions that are laid out in Article 3 of the Constitution. And then there's concurrent jurisdiction. Again, if more places have jurisdiction, who tries them, when do they try them? There's special rules set up. So, I mean, if it's a carjacking, generally the state's going to get it, or the feds are going to take it. If the state prosecutes it, the feds won't. They can, but they probably won't. There's just kind of this existing rule. That's an informal, not written down rule, but it's just kind of a, like, don't be shitty. But if there's something that's like really serious and state law doesn't provide enough penalty for it, then the state will go with it, and then the feds will go with it. So it's kind of, they kind of wait and see. But concurrent jurisdiction is interesting because trials are expensive, and holding prisoners, I mean, it's expensive. So if you want to, let's say you find the person guilty, and it's in your New York State court, and you find them guilty. So let's say it was a trial, right? And it's a felony. So it's probably the trial costs roughly $250,000 to $500,000. Then you are taking this person, and then you're going to imprison them in your state. Again, this is all taxpayer funded. Imprison them in your state for, let's say, 5 years. If they are under the age of 65 or to 70, usually it costs about between $16,000 and $21,000 a year to house a single prisoner in state prison. Right? That's just one prisoner. So multiply that by 5 years, right? And then guess what? Like we are encroaching on $1 million, right? Between the costs. Now, if the offender is over the age of 65 or over the age of 70, that cost generally skyrockets to between $60,000 and $80,000 a year to house that person, because the government has to provide healthcare, has to provide, like, they have cancer, they have to give you treatment just like they would if you were on the outside. There can be no difference there. So it's very costly, right? And so think about it this way. When talking about concurrent jurisdiction, we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it's all right. Concurrent jurisdiction, think about what the parties want, or what the states want, what the federal government wants. Because the state really has to think, like, okay, this could be a federal case. Yeah, the lady got punched in the face a couple times and her car got taken. Is that worth $1 million of taxpayer money? So usually if multiple states, so let's say that they drove from New York to Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania could charge them with a crime, usually like receiving stolen goods or something along those lines. And the feds get involved, right? So we have 3 people involved, or three jurisdictions involved. They're each going to look at it and be like, well, if somebody else takes it, I don't want it, right? Because that's $1 million that I could put towards a more serious case or different cases. Is somebody getting punched in the face a few times, their car taken, really worth $1 million? And so if another jurisdiction says they're going to file charges, generally you just let them. Like you don't, and you're just like, well, that's it, that's over, we'll move on. Again, unless the punishment is not severe enough, like to meet the crime under the law or something like that. And then we'll also consider venue. So assuming that we have jurisdiction, the court has the ability to hear the case, we have to say where, what specific courthouse, like what brick and mortar courthouse has the ability to hear this case? Where is it proper? Right, and that's venue, and we'll talk a little bit about venue. So that being said, let's jump into geographical and territorial jurisdiction, right? So as kind of said before, courts can generally only hear cases within a certain well-defined geographical area. Right? So this is generally an easy concept, right? If you break the laws of the state of New York, the state of New York can charge you, right? Like the courts in New York can hear the case. It's well defined. And what it does is the whole point is it underscores the sovereign, right? The state's desire and need to punish an offender for breaking its laws. Right? So when we think about territorial geographical jurisdiction, it makes sense when you think about it in this context, right? So Alabama has absolutely no vested interest in punishing an offender for a crime that was committed in Massachusetts under Massachusetts law, right? Like Alabama, like, they're like, okay, yeah, we'll take on that $1 million for absolutely no reason, even though you've never been here. That doesn't make sense, right? So territorial jurisdiction, for the most part, is usually state boundaries, right? So you're going to have state boundaries, the feds, generally federal boundaries. So it's a fairly easy thing to point out. You say, where's the geographical jurisdiction here? Well, probably this state, right? They broke the laws of the state of Illinois. Well, then geographical jurisdiction will be the state of Illinois. We will figure out the actual courthouse later, but in terms of geography, state of Illinois. But, and here is the big but. This generally easy concept gets really complicated regarding maritime jurisdiction. So maritime jurisdiction, basically you're referring to the government's ability, whether it's a state or the federal government, to arrest people, to have power over people who are in the ocean, basically, right? Using waterways. Maritime jurisdiction gets kind of complicated, and I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like so you can see just how crazy it is. And territorial jurisdiction can become complicated, especially when we're dealing with extradition. And extradition is removing somebody from one state to another state, or from one country. This is where it gets really really tricky. One country to another country, right? Because you say, well, hey, other country, they broke our laws. We want them back to try them, right? Because we don't want people just breaking a law and then fleeing over a border and nothing happens to them. So we go through the process of extradition, and we'll talk a little bit about the process. That being said, first, let's take a look at maritime jurisdiction. Here it is in all of its glory. This is a chart of maritime jurisdiction. Yeah, so the white in the chart reflects, and I'm going to make this bigger now. So the white in the chart here reflects, at least this triangle. This is beach and land, like, and like ocean floor bed, right? Ocean floor bed up to the beach. So depending on the state, and depending on who owns the land, right? Generally speaking, states have authority roughly up to 3 nautical miles into the ocean, right? And nautical miles starts at where the water ends, like where it hits that beach, right? 3 nautical miles out, which a nautical mile is different than a regular mile, but 3 nautical miles out. If it's a privately owned beach, then Hawaii, Louisiana, and Texas, they don't have much jurisdiction. If it's a state-owned beach, they have a little bit more jurisdiction. If it's state-owned beach, or state-owned property, or state-owned where it connects, I should say, Alabama, Alaska, California, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Mississippi, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Wisconsin say that they have essentially the ability to enforce their laws, state law, 3 feet off of the coast, right? So let's say there are 3 feet, 3 miles off of nautical miles off of the coast. So Again, and again, unless it's private, which then it's usually zero. But so you're out there, and let's say you're out with your friends, and this one's always a fun one, is gambling. All right, so if you've ever been on a cruise ship that has a casino in it, the casino will be operational 24/7 at a certain point. Generally speaking, you cannot go into the casino for the first few hours that you are at sea. And that's because you are going to be within a state's jurisdiction, and the state can determine whether or not you can gamble. And gambling is, oddly enough, the only crime that is de facto illegal unless somebody makes it legal. So if you're within 3 miles of a state, you have to follow that state's laws. So if you go out into the ocean and you kill somebody and you're 2.5 nautical miles out off the coast of Florida, the coast of Florida can and will have jurisdiction over you to try you because you've broken the laws of their land. So we say that our coasts, our land, extends further into the ocean. Now, for the feds, it gets even farther, right? So the feds can enforce federal law for up to 12 nautical miles off of the coast. Right? There are some kind of exceptions, but just speaking for the criminal law, it's going to be 12 nautical miles. So once you get to 12.1 nautical miles, it's a tricky question because we have exclusive economic zones, we have contiguous zones that extend out like 24 miles. We have some that extend out 200 miles. Again, and those are actually, and that's the exclusive economic zone. But once you hit like 200 nautical miles away from the shores of the United States, you are in the high seas, okay? Now, there's the myth that if you're in the high seas, you can basically do anything, there's no laws. That's not true. So maritime jurisdiction, and this is just a fun fact. So if you're within the enforceable range of law, then you're responsible for that law. But you're out in the high seas. You, generally speaking, have to, and you are at all times, it's thought of as an extension of the country where that ship is registered, right? So whatever flag it's flying off the back of the ship, those laws apply, right? So like even if you break the law of, like I don't know, you can't like carjack somebody on a cruise ship. Let's say that you are transporting drugs via a cruise ship. International drug and cartel, like it's not just personal use, and they catch you on board. They can put you, there are jail cells on cruise ships, fun fact, and they can hold you. And then when they get to their port of call, generally speaking, they can be tried or at least taken off the boat and then repatriated back to their country for trial. So you are subject to the state, the rules of the state that your boat is registered in. You're also subject to the rules and the laws of the state of your port of call. So basically, where are you going? Wherever you're going, you are subject to those laws on the high seas, right? So again, somebody commits some act that's in a violation of Bermuda law, you get to Bermuda, Bermuda can generally try them. It's such a weird thing. So there is no idea that like murder's legal on the high sea. No, because every ship has to be registered. If it's not registered, it's wherever you're headed, right? And you're always bound by international law and international treaties. But yeah, states, and when I say states, I'm meaning like government entities, they can they have wide sweeping control. So if you have a boat that's registered in the United States, I don't care how far, you can be off the coast of Australia. And guess what? The US Coast Guard, if they catch you, they can still pull you over off the Coast Guard or off the coast of Australia, as long as they're not in like territorial waters. And they can enforce US law, even though you are off the coast of Australia. All right, so simply because your boat is registered to the United States. It's the United States law applies. So let's talk a little bit about extradition, right? And this kind of gets brought up when we're talking about your Bermuda example, where you get to your port and then you get the person extradited or repatriated to the country that the boat is registered in, or if the law was broken while they were still in the territorial waters, back to that state for prosecution. This also applies a lot of times for people who run the border. People think like if they run the border, they'll be fine. I can tell you which countries you can go to not be extradited. But they're all really crappy. Like you don't want to go there. Like it's like, well, I can go to prison or I can go to this crappy country, and they're both equally bad. So like, is it really worth it? Up to you. That being said, when somebody commits a crime in the United States, so we're not even going to think about the world at this point, because again, this is judicial process in the United States. Somebody commits a crime in the United States and then flees to another state, right? So basically somebody commits a crime in New York and they think that if they cross it, and this is true of like high-speed chases, and I've never understood why people think this, but they think if you're in like a high-speed chase and you cross a state border, like let's say you go into Pennsylvania, that the New York State Police can't arrest you. That is not true at all. Like if they're in hot pursuit, they can arrest you. If they lose hot pursuit, then the state of Pennsylvania has to arrest you and then extradite you back to New York. So what happens is states have to give back people who flee after they've committed a crime to the state that they've committed the crime in. Right? So if we look at Article 4, Section 2 of the US Constitution, it requires the return of the offender. So despite the requirement that says like you have to turn over the offender, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And the Constitution doesn't really specify the process in which you return or extradite the offender. Right? So despite this requirement, again, the process varies from state to state. So some states, what they'll do is if they catch somebody who's wanted in they run through the database, they're not wanted in their state, but they're wanted in a different state, they will arrest them, and then they'll take them to court, and they will be adjudicated as a fugitive from justice, which basically just allows this, like the state to hold them and then until the other state can come pick them up. But they do that pretty quickly because as soon as they're adjudicated as a person fleeing from justice or absconding from justice, the other state picks up the tab to house them, right? And the other state has to arrange transportation. The other state has to come get them. So it's not at the expense of the state that you run to, it's at the expense of the state you run from. So like, if they're gonna extradite you, you can, like you fled on purpose, and they're going to spend all this money to get you back into their state, I can promise you that your plea deal is not going to be good. It's just, they're going to be ticked off because it's a pain in the butt process. If you're in Massachusetts, they use what's called a governor's warrant. And this one really pisses off prosecutors because it pisses off the governor. What it does is the governor of whatever state that the person fled to has to issue a warrant. So governors can issue warrants just like courts can, has to issue a warrant for the return of this offender and send it to the governor of the state in which the offender is being held. Then the state can extradite. So this happened a lot when I was working at PD's office in Massachusetts. I'd love to watch these cases because like it just pissed judges off. Because a lot of times somebody would like, they would flee like upper northeast, like the states are small. Like if you've ever been like Midwest or out west, like the states are freaking huge. Like you can cross Rhode Island, literally you can cross Rhode Island in 42 minutes, the entire state, right? I really like Rhode Island, but it's an interesting place. But let's say that you live in Rhode Island and you come over to Massachusetts, you want to go to Boston instead of Providence for like a concert or something like that. And on your way, you get stopped in Massachusetts. And let's say you get stopped in Massachusetts for like speeding or something that's not like inherently criminal. And they run your license, and it turns out you're wanted in Rhode Island, which, if you don't know geography, borders Massachusetts. So what can they do? They can arrest you as a fugitive for justice. And then, generally speaking, they have to hold you, they can hold you up to a certain time frame until they get a governor's warrant. The governor's warrant says it's from the governor of the other, it would be Rhode Island, saying that this person is alleged to have committed these crimes in this state, and therefore under Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, we request extradition. Then the court grants it. Then the other state, as soon as the governor's warrant is issued or granted, I should say, the other state starts picking up the bill. And then it's still up to the other state, let's say in this case Rhode Island, to pay for your stay in the jail in Massachusetts, and then to come get you. It's never the state's job to force you out. It's the other state that has to come get you. Now, that's kind of complicated in and of itself, but when we complicate it even more, we'll talk about when an offender flees the country. So generally speaking, when we're talking about extradition between countries, we are talking about a patchwork of treaties and international agreements to extradite, right? So if you run to a state and the state doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States or isn't in an agreement with the United States to extradite, they don't have to, right? So it's part of the reason why a lot of Nazi soldiers after the war, who were wanted for war crimes and various other things, fled to Argentina, right? Like they all fled to Argentina, and it wasn't like it was just because Argentina wouldn't extradite, right? For the atrocities that the Nazis committed, Argentina just wouldn't extradite. So they all fled to friggin' Argentina. So having these treaties and these agreements are really important. Let me back this out and I'll show you. Here is our bilateral extradition countries, right? So these are all countries which the United States says, we will give you back, anybody who flees to the United States, we'll give them back to you. And you have to give anybody who flees the United States or flees your country or flees our country to your country back to us, right? So it's bilateral, it's between two countries. And this is just the list, again, alphabetical order of the countries as of 2006. If it's not on the list, it may still be governed by an international agreement or something along those lines. Usually the UN wants you to extradite. I mean, it's just like, why are you hiding somebody? This really became a case and still is in the news as an issue with the case of Julian Assange, who basically took refuge and sought refuge in an embassy in a state that didn't, or a country that didn't generally extradite. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing because you have to you're guided by whatever treaty you have, and if you don't have a treaty, the other state can still extradite you. It's not like they won't. They can if they want to. And because it's on the United States, if the United States is trying to get somebody in a place where we don't have a treaty, it's up to that country to do what they want with them, right? So one thing you'll notice if you look through this list, one thing that's missing, one big country that kind of stands out, it starts with an R and ends in Russia, right? Where's Russia? We don't have a bilateral extradition agreement with Russia. So Russia, we kind of have a good faith agreement, right? Like we kind of like this informal agreement that they'll extradite, we'll extradite to them. But the reason we don't with Russia is kind of the same reason that we don't with China. It's because we understand that there's a lot of people who are fleeing political violence. And we don't want to have to be bound, or we don't have to return somebody who's fleeing from political violence. You know, I mean, think about, I mean, the corruption in those countries, and you know, they think the same thing of us. So that's why Edward Snowden took refuge in Russia. Right? He was wanted in the United States. And Russia gave him shelter. Right? Because again, it did raise an issue of whether he was being persecuted or whether he was not being persecuted. So it's kind of an interesting take. Now, that being said, even with countries that we do have extradition agreements with, right? Extradition agreements are subject to certain limitations and conditions imposed by countries, right? So, for instance, this is a really important one. Canada, France, England, Mexico, Italy, and a whole host of other countries who will extradite criminals to the United States, like ones that are wanted for, you know, horrible crimes, like they're wanted for rape, they're wanted for whatever. They will extradite those, no problem. We have great relationships with them. Okay? If, however, you commit a crime in which it's murder-based offense in a jurisdiction, and the federal government does have the death penalty, but you're in a jurisdiction, let's say you're in Texas, that executes the most people, and you commit first-degree murder. First-degree murder makes you eligible for the death penalty. If you flee, like if you know that you're going to be caught or whatever, and you flee to Canada, France, England, Mexico, Italy, or really just there's a long list, they will not extradite you unless the state and the federal government guarantee in writing that you will not receive the death penalty if you are convicted. And generally, we have to stand by it, because as soon as we break it, they're not going to ever extradite somebody to us again. They'll hold them, they'll imprison them, but they're not going to extradite somebody who, because they don't have the death penalty, they don't believe in the death penalty, they believe it's morally wrong, so the countries don't have it. So they're not going to extradite you unless the United States promises in writing that you will not be put to death. Right? So they can still sentence you to life in prison without parole. That's fine, but the death penalty, it's not. So your best bet is if you are in a jurisdiction where they have the death penalty, and you do a crime that's death penalty eligible. My best advice to you, again, non-legal advice, but as a friend, is get a damn flight to Canada, or like just go across the border. Like that's all you have to do is just cross that damn border, and they won't extradite you unless the state and the feds promise not to impose the death penalty. So that all kind of falls under like this territorial jurisdiction idea, right? That states and we extradite them because it's their geographical area that's of concern, right? Or countries, it's their geographical area that's of concern. Again, Alabama does not care that Billy Bob violated a law in Massachusetts. They're not going to try him. They don't care. It's not going to. Alabama's going to be like, well, we're going to extradite him to Alabama and try him. If he didn't violate Alabama law, then Alabama's not going to try him. Again, one, it raises serious constitutional issues. Two, why would they? And then three, think about the expenses involved. Like how much a court case costs. right? If a sovereign can get out of having to prosecute somebody and that person still be prosecuted, that sovereign's going to do it, right? Again, it's largely a cost-saving matter. So assuming that we are in the right, let's just make it easy and say state, right? A court must also possess subject matter jurisdiction. So this exists when the law, so the law of the geographical area, so the state, permits the court to hear a case. So when we think of subject matter jurisdiction, there's really two types of courts. We have courts of general jurisdiction and we have courts of limited jurisdiction. Now, generally speaking, state courts, they will have both limited jurisdiction and general jurisdiction, but we consider states to have general jurisdiction. Basically, the state can hear any case arising under its laws, right? Unless the law is exclusive, or the case is exclusively reserved by federal law, right? So there are some laws that you violate that they are a violation of state law, but they can also be a violation of federal law. And generally speaking, if it's both, the state's gonna take it. But if it's exclusively reserved by federal law, so if Congress says no, we want federal courts to hear these types of cases, then the state kind of loses subject matter jurisdiction and has to turn the case over to the feds. So general jurisdiction, you can hear anything in this geographical area, like the state, you can hear anything that the law says you can. And so, I mean, we're talking everything from petty shoplifting, petty theft, to first-degree murder. Generally speaking, states have broad subject matter jurisdiction. On the other hand, federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction, right? And so what we kind of mean by this is the Constitution is not really specific on like what the federal courts can do. And we'll talk about that when we talk about their structure starting next class. But they're a limited jurisdiction, so they don't have nearly as many crimes. They don't have nearly as much, even though the US code is fairly lengthy, they can only hear certain offenses, right? They can only deal with certain offenses. If it deals with a violation of well-established federal law, if we're talking between states, things like that, then the feds can get involved. But generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of federal murder, or there's not a whole lot of federal criminal laws. That being said, for instance, one example is there is no blanket federal murder statute. So it is illegal to kill a federal officer or employee in the course of their duty. And that's about as close as we get to a federal murder statute. So you can kill somebody, let's say you live in the state of New York, the person you want to kill lives in the state of New York, and you don't cross any borders to get to that person. You just stay in the state of New York and get back from that place, and then you just go back to your house still in the state of New York. You don't leave the state. The state can charge you for murder, like there's no question, right? The feds can't, because there is no federal law against murder. There's state law, but there's not federal law. Again, with the exception of federal agent or employee in the course of their duty. So that kind of gives you an idea of how limited federal law is. We tend to have this misconception that if it's in federal court, it means it's terrible, or it's like the highest crime or the worst crime possible. That's just not true. Most crimes are going to be, I mean, like 99% of crimes are going to be at the state level, not the federal level, because there won't be a federal law in point. So again, they're limited jurisdiction. That should show you how limited they are. Like if the feds won't prosecute murder, they don't have too much that they can prosecute unless they can, and they have to relate everything back to like they have to relate everything back to some thing in the Constitution, and usually it's going to relate back to, we'll talk about this in the next class, usually it's going to relate back to the Interstate Commerce Clause, right? Like it's been the most kind of like flexible clause there is in the Constitution. So assuming that we have geographical jurisdiction, right? So it happened in this well-defined geographical territory. It happened in the state. And state law says it's illegal and the state can prosecute it. It's not reserved for the feds. It's just a matter of state law. The court also has to possess personal jurisdiction. Right? So this only exists when a court can exercise power over a particular defendant. Right? So generally speaking, the defendant has to have had, and this is this is more of a civil law term, but it applies. Just speaking, you have to have, quote, minimum contact with the state, right? In order for the state to be able to extradite you, to pull you back in, to have personal jurisdiction over you. Now, this seems easy, like an easy concept, and for the most part it is. Because if you kill somebody in the state of New York, you've had minimum contacts with the state of New York because you've availed yourself of the law of the state of New York, you've come to New York, you've stepped in the borders of New York, you've had minimum contacts with the state. Done deal, right? It gets a little bit more tricky when we're trying to find venue. Which county were you in, what township, that sort of thing kind of comes into play. But generally speaking, personal jurisdiction is fairly easy. But it's becoming more and more difficult as we see there's a sharp decline in violent crime, there's a sharp decline in property crime, but we're starting to see cybercrime and cyber attacks becoming kind of a new threat. And again, we had a cyber attack not too long ago. So I ask you to quickly consider the hypothetical that's in box 1.19 in your textbook. I'll scroll down to it here. Here it is. John Doe, who resides in Montana, is charged with committing computer fraud, specifically using the internet to commit fraud, which is a federal and a state offense. All of Mr. Doe's victims were from Montana as well. So he was in Montana. Montana is where he committed his crime, maybe, and all of his victims are in Montana. Okay? However, unbeknownst to Mr. Doe, and this is actually true, simply sending an email results in that email being relayed between computers in several different states and several different countries. As such, one of the states, Vermont, which Mr. Doe's fraudulent emails pass through, wants to charge him with computer fraud as well. Mr. Doe has never physically been in the state. Can the state charge him? Right, so cybercrime is making personal jurisdiction difficult because Mr. Doe did everything in Montana. His victims were all in Montana. He has never been to Vermont. But has he? Right, because think about like instrumentalities, things that we do. Basically, under the law, anything that we do, we send, that we produce is an extension of our person. Right, so if he knew, and this kind of comes into the question of if he knew that when he sent his emails, they were going to be relayed all over the place, then maybe we could say minimum contacts. But again, he had contacts with the state of it, went through Vermont, but it was out of his control, right? So he never wanted to be in Vermont. He wanted to be in Montana. So it's a really difficult question to answer. And it's one that legislatures at the state level and federal level are trying to deal with and wrap their heads around. How do we get personal jurisdiction when it involves cybercrime and somebody's in a different country or a different state? But now you know that anytime you Google anything, anytime you send an email, whatever, that Google search, that email, it gets bounced around from computers all over the United States, all over the world. So you can hit Google search and go from Florida to China to Russia, back to here, like it does. It makes this big circle. That's how the internet works. It's just interconnected computers. So now you know, like, don't commit fraud. Assuming that we have personal jurisdiction, we also have to have hierarchical jurisdiction. Basically, we have a trial court where the trial happens. Then we have an intermediate court of appeals where if you don't like the result, you can appeal. And then we have the Supreme Court, right? This is just the traditional structure, not true of every state, not even true of the federal government. We'll get into that later in next class when we start diving in. But generally speaking, we're looking here for either original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that you are in part of the hierarchy where you can try the case, where you decide whether or not somebody is guilty or innocent. You have appellate jurisdiction if you can review the decision of the trial court, or the court of original jurisdiction. And so that usually applies to the Intermediate Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Generally speaking, you cannot have a trial at the Court of Appeals. You can't have a trial at the Supreme Court. Your trial occurs at the court with original jurisdiction, which is the trial court. So hierarchical jurisdiction is fairly easy. There's very few times, and there are a couple times, but there are very few times where it kind of comes into play as to whether or not a particular court is in the proper hierarchy, right? Usually it's just like, okay, take them to the trial court, like for trial. That makes sense. Again, I've talked about concurrent jurisdiction. Again, this is possessed by every state between the federal government and the states. We discussed the Fifth Amendment, the prohibition on double jeopardy. We discussed the doctrine of dual sovereignty. And again, if you want to see a pretty good example, you can look at box 1.11, which is Heath v. Alabama. And it's a really interesting case that asks the question whether the prosecution in the state of Alabama, after a prosecution in the state of Georgia, constituted double jeopardy. And the answer was no, because of the dual sovereignty doctrine. And if you read the text, it really goes into play as to the dual sovereignty doctrine and what it is and why it's not a violation of the Fifth Amendment and all that lovely jazz. So assuming that we can do all of that, we've gone through that whole system. The last question we have to ask ourselves is venue. What venue is proper, right? So according to the Sixth Amendment, the US Constitution, a defendant must be tried in the state, okay, and district, a little bit more difficult, where the crime occurred. So once we've established jurisdiction, then we have to figure out the precise location, the physical brick and mortar courthouse. We have to get the touchable building. We have to figure out which touchable building we can hear the case in, because it says the state and the district where the crime occurred. Now, usually this is going to be like, okay, they were found here, and this was in this county, in this state, that you're going to try it in that county court. It can be difficult, especially if there's like state lines crossed, or if there's state lines not really established that well. It can be difficult. But this is something the prosecutor has to show the court by a preponderance of the evidence, so by 50.01% or 50% and a feather, a little bit more likely than not that this courthouse is proper. Now, some states require the prosecutor to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt before they can even bring the charges. They have to show like, this is the right courthouse, we're the place we're supposed to be, right? Because this is what justice is, this is where justice is supposed to be done. If we do it anywhere else, it's not justice. And it can be proven by circumstantial evidence or direct evidence. Direct evidence is, well, it was located right here. Circumstantial evidence is, well, based upon the facts, or we can infer that the crime occurred here, right? So it can be circumstantial, or it can be direct evidence. We found the body here, or we believe the crime occurred here. And venue doesn't really get too complicated. The only time venue gets complicated is when we're talking about civil lawsuits. Then the district in which it occurs gets involved, and at the federal level, it's a little interesting. But yeah, so I mean, it's not an overly difficult concept. It's just jurisdiction we have to prove, right? We have to show the court beyond a reasonable doubt, or by response to the evidence, depending on the state, that you have geographical, subject, personal jurisdiction, hierarchical jurisdiction, and issues of concurrent jurisdiction, and then that you are at assuming that you're in the right state, the right geographical area, that you are at the right physical courthouse, the right building, right? So there's a hypothetical on page 1.12 that we won't get into today, but take a look at it, because next class we are going to kind of get out of this broad sweeping, this is what the courts are, this is what the law is. we're going to get into, all right, how is the federal court system, how is it organized? What does it look like? And then next class, we'll get to the states, and we'll look at the states and see how they're organized. So we're going to start kind of getting more and more specific as we go throughout this course. That being said, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at any point, text me, call me, wherever, however you want to get a hold of me. Thank you so much for attending today, and I will see you at a later date.